The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn.
Hi there.
And today we're talking to Stephan Hammel of Measures Taken fame.
Sure.
And we're going to be talking about the Marxist conception of class. And I wrote you about this because I listened to the last publicly available Measures Taken as of June. And listened to some of your implications about class and watched amazed as your other post-trot and neo-cal friends were aghast in your assertions. And that amused me. But I also realized that I've had issues with with the definition of class for a while. Famously, when Marx goes to actually kind of analytically define it in Capital Volume 3, the manuscript cuts off. The prior definitions that you have, like one is published in, I guess the ABC, whatever the catechism, the communist catechism text that becomes a background piece for the manifesto that's written by Engels. There's a definition of proletariat, not working class, but proletariat in that, that's revised away kind of on purpose, because I'm guessing it's one of the areas where Marx and Engels were not satisfied with their prior theoretical conceptions, either one of them. Right. There's discussion of why Marx uses proletariat in some instances and working class in another when he's talking to like artisans in the Communist League and the development of a proletarian consciousness. But this vagary leads to all kinds of fun stuff, like Maoists trying to argue that non-productive workers don't count as proletariat, or that first world workers don't count as proletariat, or that white workers don't count as proletariat. It leads to even some neo-cals trying to say that the ownership of even non-productive personal property, such as having a bank loan for a home, removes you from the proletariat and destroys proletarian consciousness, whatever that means in that scenario. It's led to, I think, all kinds of 20th century class theories. We talked a little about before, the managerial class, the administrative class, the intellectia class by Christopher Lasch, plus the bureaucratic class, which, to be fair to Lasch, are actually much more delimited than, say, the professional managerial classes as a catch-all term thrown around now and read back on to people like Lasch and even Frederick Pollock and et cetera. So people have taken this like codification and hybrid theory of Ehrenreich and retrojected it back onto people who didn't use it. Even if they had, like, one of the things about Christopher Lasch is because of the dominance of Paul Sweezy and Marxist academia, he seems to think that monopoly capital has moved working class functions from an inherent class conflict to something that you need to like form another myth around and create a working class traditionalism and populism. He doesn't come to this conclusion until the 80s, admittedly. It's very late, but this is something that he tries to do. I say all this because it seems like despite the return of class politics,
right,
in quotation marks for those who aren't watching but listening, that we're murkier on any conception of class than we've ever been. And sometimes the same people are like lazy Christians talking about God, whereas like they have different conceptions that they invoke that are mutually incompatible, but since they're not thinking about them and this invoking them kind of ad hoc in the working class thinks like me way, they will posit something entirely inconsistent, and even someone smart like Eric Olin Wright in his Understanding Class book. Yeah, we'll talk about them. I interviewed him right before he died. Well, about a year before he died. But the interview's lost because it was on a computer that I had to move. I had to relocate between Mexico and Egypt when I was
when you were exiled from the Soviet Union for dissidents and moving between places.
So I was relocating from Mexico to Egypt, and I had this 4-year-old MacBook Air that just died. And when we went to recover the files on it, they were dead. And so the interview was lost. I will also admit it wasn't a particularly great interview because Eric Olin Wright was clearly a little bit. I mean, I think he was. This was around 2015. So
he was sick for a long time.
He was pretty sick. Like you could tell. The longer we talked, I had to like rein in the conversation and kind of help him remember his book. So
he was blogging right up until the moment that he passed. It was an extraordinary thing. It actually, for someone who I've argued with in my head for so long, it was humanizing and perspective making to see that. Anyway, may rest in peace. We'll have lots to say, I hope, about
Understanding Class is a crazy book. And it's a crazy book because when I tried to interview him about like how he overlaid his conceptions, he basically gave me like a 15-part multi-layer grid. It was like,
right. And I get wrapped up in this blackmail. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then some of his earlier conceptions are like, he has a 9-point grid, but the 9 points really clearly just for like parsimony of a grid, not because it actually makes analytic sense.
Well, he talks about the embarrassment of an overly large middle class at this level of development in capitalist system, as if this were now a terrible problem. It's not. It's a neo-Bernsteinian worry that, oh no, there are people who don't fall neatly into the hyper-polarized class categories that we're familiar with from our class politics, not from capital, of course, but from our class politics. And therefore, we need some kind of very sophisticated empirical detail to talk about what's really happened. And then from there, maybe we'll go and correct the political economic assumptions. I think that's exactly backwards. But I, as I said in just before we went on, I have some really heterodox things to say about class. My approach is shared by no one and is probably just patently offensive. But I can tell you where it begins.
Okay, let's start. Where did your theory of class begins that is so offensive and will be shared by nobody? Let's talk about this.
I know. I mean, maybe not even you, despite how much we agree on it in general. Okay, so I take it that I take seriously the idea that class is not really a theoretical category in capital, but it is a theoretical category rather than an empirical category. So class is older than any of the major categories like surplus value or exploitation, et cetera. Class is in fact a product of the socialist literature of the 1840s, when they're trying to make a distinction between the juridical categories that the French Revolution had successfully overthrown and replaced, and the economic forces that were nonetheless present on the ground, regulating society and causing inequities. And so class was first developed by people like Lawrence von Stein. People came before Marx in order to refer to classes that weren't official juridical categories, but nonetheless present in society. The long and the short of that is that Marx inherits his concept of class, doesn't develop his own. And that inherited concept of class is inheritable because it's tied to a politics, not to a political economic theory. What's beautiful about the concept is that it's power lies in it being non-empirical. That is, you're not supposed to go out into the world and say, that's a proletarian and that's a capitalist, in the same way that you have to be able to go around the pre-modern world and say, that's a lord and that's a serf. Those are legal categories, right? That you'll have papers that determine that, and in fact,
clothing limit, sumptuary laws, all kind. You will be able to tell from a distance because clothing regulations and whatnot.
Right. And as we know, in the capitalist system, that's just not what happens. In fact, we have these, we have these norms around selling our labor that don't look at all like these staunch and empirically verifiable categories. So, the puzzle as, who's in what class? Are you in the working class? I think is just an odd and meaningless question. No one is in a class. A class politics is a politics based on political economic insights that allows us to fight for a totally different set of productive relations in order to make ourselves less poor. So I take it that class politics are essential. Identifying people in specific classes is useless. And the two needn't have anything to do with one another.
Well, I realized this a little bit when I started pondering over what was meant by proletarianization without becoming a proletariat in Marx, which is hinted at as early as the manifesto. So that's 1848 documents. And it's one of the concepts that I find maintained throughout, is this idea of other classes being proletarianized. So you don't look at the class origins of the individual. You look at the class movement, quote, for itself, and understanding the class as a category in itself, but not as something for which you can discreetly belong. Now, I forgot this for years because I also became obsessed with like who counts in what class and where. I'm like, these, and I've now mentioned this in 3 different interviews, but it's one of the most illuminating problems is like, I literally got in a debate with someone about, value theory, and why they rejected value theory was like, well, does the person who produces a sandwich, since it is made for immediate consumption but futurized as a commodity, produce? Are they a productive laborer? Are they a non-productive laborer? Because and I'm like, fuck if I know. They made a sandwich. Like, there's a physical commodity, but yes, you used it, but fuck. Like there's no, like, unless you think there's some magic involved in the specific instance of when I build something and it is traded for a commodity, even in abstract, okay? And what we get here is the abstractification of capital, whereas instead of saving commodities, we're now saving commodity futures, which is an abstract off of commodity made to be used, and not saved as some kind of store of value or something else. And this is this is part of what Marx means by abstractification, but I think this blows people's minds because you'll get the other dumb questions about, well, what do you do that 40% of wage earners now have stock options through 401ks, and it does like partial owners of capital, and then 60% of them have investment through owning a home, even though they really don't own it because it's really owned by a bank. But whatever. I don't
like to do this like everything I don't like is a false religion thing, but it does seem to me like the discourse of like ritual purity. So the moment I open the iPhone and open up the Robinhood app and invest, I become a capitalist because I've now poisoned myself as a personal measure with some sort. I take it that can't be important. And people think it's really important because people think that there's no kind of, you need to be able to subjectively adhere to political commitments that derive from your identity in order to have a politics at all. And I take it that you can preserve a subjectively authoritative, even if objectively defined class politics without identifying yourself in any way, without engaging in this discourse of, as I say, of ritual purity and who's in and who's out. And at what moment are you in? At what moment are you out? Can you own a house and be a worker?
Are wage earners who work for the state, thus off of indirect surplus value, such as teachers, are they PMC? I actually do subscribe to the fact we're labor aristocrats, but it's actually not because of our wage relation. It's because actually we're credentialed and cartelled. Sure. But regardless, that itself is not important, even in the case, you know. And then you start getting into like people whose imagination of the working class is basically the blue collar industrial worker from the 1950s. And even at the broadest definition that I can possibly subscribe to, when I plug that into the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or look it up in any country actually, because we check up on that, which is productive manufacturing labor plus logistics around that. You're only dealing with 13% of the population at best.
Right.
And so I got this really, I think one of the reasons why this is important, and I hate to get derailed in the PMC debates, but since that seems to be de rigueur on both the post-left, the national conservative right, and the social democratic left, as a kind of cop-out explanation for why the Bernie campaign failed in round 2.
Sure. Along with many other motivations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff in there. But it basically does something that I've been worried about since Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle piece. People may have forgotten about this, but I criticized Mark Fisher on 2 things. One was throwing the baby out with the bathwater, not because identity politics made sense. It didn't. But because trying to posit a tailless form of class politics where we assume a British cultural definition of what working class means, meaning you were born into that habitus, and that's what defines you, regardless of where you are now, was to me like you're fighting identity politics by positing class as an identity politics.
It's a disaster.
Yeah, and it's a nightmare. I mean, like it actually fundamentally undoes some fundamental Marxist goals, which is like, how the fuck do you reify a class, make it a dictatorship of the proletariat, but also tell it is fine as it is, its goals and capital are good, and also you should be proud of that, and simultaneously we're going to abolish class altogether through making you the dictatorship. Like that if you have that definition of class, it's hard with the Marxist definition of class to sell that, but with a kind of what I like to call the workerist definition of class, the worker as identity, it's impossible. Like you can't do all those things.
And in historical terms, it's nonsense. So for example, let's go back to the 1840s, which is where I think the modern concept of class really originates. Who is it appealing to? Who are the workers of the 1840s? Well, largely they're artisans. Right? They're not your blue collar industrial employee. They're not working for Ford. They're silk weavers and Fabergé egg makers. And so because of that, then you've got a workerism of the 1840s that translates into workerism, and that can't be our definition. It just can't be a cultural definition of class. Plus, of course, what happens to you when you're fired? Do you slip out of the logic of class because you don't occupy one of the quote empty positions in the productive system?
That gets you into the whole class is an objective relationship to the, what is it that Clive Burrows says? Class is an objective relationship to the means of production, but say lumpenization or declasse is actually a social category about the lack of that relationship. But then I throw out Clyde, and I did. How is that distinct from the reserve army of labor? And he's like, it's kind of not. And then I'm like, well, this whole thing falls down then. Like,
why do we need it? I mean, the question really should be, why do we need a concept of class? What is it concept of class good for? If we know we can get through capital, and look, we should note something for the benefit of listeners, if for nothing else, that Capital Volume 3 draft predates the final version of Capital Volume 1 by a significant number of years. So if Marx had needed a concept of class, surely he would have introduced it sooner into the... I mean, there's no reason to believe that he would have finished that chapter. Plus, if you look at that chapter, the first part of it, he's critiquing other people's concept of class. In specific, he's talking about how where you derive your income cannot be the definition of your class status. I can easily, complete in my mind a version of that section, which just argues against, any of these flat-footed conceptions of class as such, in which case I'll have Marx agree with me. But because Marx is basically silent on this issue. Oh, by the way, Bertel Ollman has a classic article I recommend to everybody, in which he just tracks every instance of the word class in the extant Marx literature. And I got to tell you, It is all over the place. You cannot look at the Communist Manifesto and then compare it to Capital and then compare it to the Grundrisse and think that every time he's using the word class, he's referring to roughly the same thing. There isn't even two competing theories of class. There is no such theory at all. So, I mean, that's just something we have to confront. Marx doesn't have a class theory.
And I think when you say that to people, you know, value theorist, workerist, social democrats, Leninist, etc., they're going to fall apart when you point that out to them. Because I have also noted, going through the MAGA work, that there's no way that every instance of that, or every instance of the mention of lumpen proletariat, or even, I think the only thing that seems consistently defined is bourgeoisie, actually. That's like the only thing that I have a consistent definition for. And there are times where Marx even admits it, like he's using working class and proletariat it's only the working class in certain specific instances. And also sometimes artisans are included in this conception and sometimes they're not. And he's kind of, you can kind of read letters of him going back and forth on that. And the whole, you know, I mean, you have the thin line between petty bourgeois and not, and this, that, and the other. I find this really useful to think about, but I also find it really obscuring, because while we can go back to the 1840s, if we jump ahead to the 1920s or even the 19-teens, where you have the Bolsheviks changing the program from the SPD to include the, you know, instead of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry.
And the peasantry.
Right, which people forget. I mean, there's a reason why there's a sickle, guys. And otherwise we just have a hammer. So
well, it's also why there's none in the CPUSA logo. It's a gear, you'll notice.
Right. Which is actually weirdly instructive, and I've always been a little bit upset that the CPUSA had the best signifier for developed world communism.
I know. I had this comrade once whose name I'll never mention, but who spent about months trying to design a proper 21st century logo, trying desperately to replace the hammer and the sickle with like a computer,
but not a rose or anything stupid like that.
No. Right? Yeah. Well, no, we don't want to. Just a loaf of bread, actually. Hopefully. No. So what is Capital really about? Why is it the case that Marx can get through Capital without a theory of class? Well, it's because Capital is not really about the struggle for socialism. It's about the mode of production. That is, it's about what kinds of how human productive labor has developed in characteristic ways across sectors. And the way in which our social relations have to track to that mode of production. So, it's the case, for example, that, well, let's take an obvious case, right? So textile manufacture in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, goes through a technological revolution that radically changes the social relations of production that are meaningful in that sector because of the relatively small degree of control over the means of production that any worker in that sector exerts given the new technology. And technology broadly conceived, right? But given the new mode of production, that's not true for lens grinders. Lens grinders, up until the time of up until after Waterloo, were still grinding lenses with what was essentially a potter's wheel, and a hand crank, one by one, workshop by workshop, and training, apprentices in the art form. Now, there was a different set of social relations for a different level of technology. And it just turns out that after lens making looks a lot more like the mechanization that was present in textile manufacture, that you get a kind of parallelism between these two kinds of relationships to the means of production that would allow you to see that there's a broader historical trend involved. And this is that machine, from cooperation to, manufacture to machinofacture part in the middle of Capital, which I take to be the centerpiece of Capital. It's about the history of technology. Now, that doesn't mean we need to abandon a class politics necessarily. We should just know what we're doing when we pick up a class politics. And I take that that's the opposite of personal identification. By the way, all politics of personal identification are doomed to be minoritarian. I take it.
Go. That's probably the most controversial thing you said today. So let's go into that. Why why would all identitarian politics be minoritarian? I have an inkling, but I want to hear your logic on this.
So I take it that identity politics, now broadly conceived, right, that could include a workerist identity politics, has to be about, I mean, it is about the logic of self-fashioning. And, you know, this has to do with your consumption habits, your politics understood as a kind of expression of your personal identity, itself a kind of consumption habit. If it's going to be cultural in that way, the politics of self-identification, then, you know, whether or not it's useful to identify that way, it's just, it'll be hopeless to convince a majority of people to adopt your self-identification. First of all, how do you get to adopt one rather than another? How are you going to convince a Christian that it's more important that he identify himself as a worker than as a Christian?
Right, or a black person as a worker that as a black person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't want to go into that realm at all. I just don't want to enter the room.
Right. For obvious effect that every debate around that, no matter what side, tends to be in bad faith. But I think that's interesting, and that actually is one of the weird debates, I think, around Bernstein versus Kautsky, where I don't side with either one of them, honestly, because Bernstein has this very analytical, in fact, that I was literally talking to my old co-host Amog Sahu that Bernstein's definition of class analysis is part of why Lukács does all the weird shit Lukács does to like make Marxism not make any normative claims, so that you can empirically check, and like class isn't something you can empirically, which I actually think that part of Lukács may be correct. I think the rest of it's nonsense. But that what that gets you out of is the debates of the Second International about who counts as lumpen. And I will tell people will be surprised at who they thought counted as lumpen. It wasn't just the weird list that Marx put in the Brumaire. It's also like every service sector worker that's seasonal, all seasonal and migrant labor,
shoe shiners.
Yeah, I mean, like anybody who's in a weird gap between petite bourgeois and artisan. And so, but these eat up an inordinate amount of the debate in the Second International. But then you have the whole Bernsteinian thing, you know, the industrial proletariat is only like 40% of the population. That's the most it's ever gotten to. Have a nice day, bye. Capitalism's resolving itself, blah, 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 blah. Something, an idea we'll see again when Moshe Postone.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and the working classes.
Moshe Postone's a Bernsteinist, but I kind of is, actually. So...
Well, I mean, you know, so Moshe Postone, to take Moshe Postone, here's, okay, so we get into, one of the themes so far has been the traditional inherited concept of class, as we've gotten it from the Marxist tradition thus far, leads to some really blind alleys, some of which have to do with sort of politics and bad faith around identity. Some of them have to, some of them have to do with just analytical murkiness. And then some of them have to do with, a hatred of the working class, or a borderline hatred of the working class in the work of someone like Moshe Postone, who blames the working class for something like, well, anti-Semitism, which comes actually startlingly close to this, to the concept of the white working class, another false empirical category, ideological concept that we talk about in the post-Trump era.
Right. Well, what's interesting is so we have this change in the 20s, and then you have this massive shift under the assumption that the MCM prime circuit was done because the contradictions of capital have been resolved by monopoly capital. And we were now either end, if you were a right winger, a managerial state, if you're a left winger, a administrative state. And from the standpoint of like the Lukácsian notion of class, class contradictions are no longer primary anymore. Like anything can substitute now for this, for this concern. And that's when you see first the Frankfurt School doing the thing where it abandons Austro-Marxism, and then actually from a logic that I think it's consistent from Lukács, which I think people are surprised that I would assert that, but that because the revolution didn't go the way it was supposed to go, because revolution as the Marxist science of liberation did not happen, that they actually work backward to the authoritarian personality and the dialectic of enlightenment. And I think there's interesting stuff in those books, but to come up with a thesis about why Lukács could have been right and yet still wrong, and thus the working class is no longer a revolutionary subject, and thus it's actually secretly reactionary because of that. Here's study after study that shows that. Actually, interestingly, some more objective sociology actually indicated that the Frankfurt schools, attacking the working class for having regressive attitudes didn't even match up to what liberal sociologists thought. Like, it was too extreme. So it's a very... I bring all this up because it just points to the problem this cul-de-sac gets you in. And I do think what we have is an extension of, so by the Third International, we have all these conceptions of the peasants and like mass lines and popular fronts and the abandonment of any united front, the abandonment, like changing of what class politics means. And then in the 50s and 60s, you have this assumption that basically Hilferding was right, but was just off by 2 world wars. And now there is no, the M to MC prime thing is solved. Ipso facto, we have new classes, the administrative class, the working class as opposed to the proletariat, the third world working class, first world labor aristocracy. The number of new class categorizations that come out of Marxist exponentially grows. But what I find fascinating is they often have multiple conflicting criterion to define them. So for example, the thing, someone like Clive Barrow, like lumpen's not a class, it's a social category because lumpen has no clear relationship to any means of production.
Right, to the mode of production.
Right. Or the other one I remember is we can only talk about the political will of classes unless the class for itself, with the actual existence of classes don't matter, which I think is close to where you are.
Ironically, let's talk about political constitution a bit. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So what do you mean by that? Because I often see this used actually to mean, when people invoke the class for itself, they actually tend to mean whatever I think is true, we already know, and we just need a working class to glom onto it, and then it would be a class for itself and have a clear class politics. I get the enunciation for that because while I think it is broadly speaking true that Marx does not have a consistent definition of class, and sometimes it seems sociological, sometimes it's productive, sometimes it's something else. What I get a little bit more frustrated in is who the fuck are you talking about then when we talk about this? And they usually mean the friends of my weird sectarian group. I mean, who... Sure. Yeah. I mean, like...
That's the class for itself. It's always you,
Right, exactly.
This is the same with the PMC, right? You'll notice that the PMC debate is dominated by people who identify in the PMC.
Right. Oh yeah. It is a bad consciousness, shock of self-resignation. And the people who will argue with me about this will always say, well, I'm in it, I know what it's like. And I'm like, that's weirdly, you're arguing a standpoint, actual argument for the existence of a class because you identify as in it and you recognize people as shittier versions of what you aspire to be. Ipso facto, that no, we need to get rid of the PMC for the worker. But what we actually mean in most of these cases, and people like Michael Lind and Peter Turchin actually make this explicit, where they're like, well, yeah, but the working class is inert. So what we actually mean is we need a better elite. And we might have to stop the circulation of elites. And you will note that they will use wildly variant things. And one of the things with PMC is, depending on how you define it, is either 1% of the population. That's the Adolf Reed, people with specific fiduciary responsibility who exist above most most worker conflicts and maybe have mixed income sources, and he has a lot of criterion. And then you have like the Kaplan Lewis spitball, which is everyone who's ever gotten anything above an associate's degree, which when people talk to me about that, I'm literally like, well, okay, so you talk about the working class and you talk about how the PMC is minoritarian, but the working class you mean is blue collar working class, which is 13% of the population, and the PMC, by your broad ass definition, is 40 to 45%. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If I was building a politics, I don't know which one I would favor, but the one that you're arguing, you basically can't mean. You actually can't mean what you say you mean. Like,
imagine trying to build a party on the basis of your class status, right? So what kind of a test would you have to deliver to a new party recruit to determine their class status, and therefore determine whether or not they can come to meetings, whether or not they can be trustworthy, right? I mean, look, if everyone behaves on the basis of their class interests, and those class interests are objective and can be made conscious, that's the class for itself, but aren't necessarily conscious, you're always acting on your perceived interests. Well, then we'd really want to know that there are no capitalist interlopers or petty bourgeois interlopers or lumpen interlopers when we're forming the party. First of all, no party has ever behaved like this.
Right. Even in the SPD, which would broker these debates as if it would behave like it, did not actually behave this way.
No.
So neither did the Bolsheviks in their strictest period of membership, even in the debates between Lenin and Martov. Like, they didn't operate this way either.
That's right. You know, I'm not allowed.
Did operate this way would be the Chinese Maoist after the revolution.
Well, right. In which case, we're not talking about a revolutionary party.
No, we're talking about a party that's trying to manage things with literally a caste of people based on your family's class origins. Like,
well, then it's a juridical category again, and you know, here then it's a category that we've made socially. We know that it's socially constructed, right? Yeah, exactly. So what would it mean then to become class conscious if you don't have this kind of conception of this empirical conception of class, where you're trying to point to someone and try to decide whether or not they're in one class or the other? Well, it would mean that you're identifying with you're identifying with a political movement to overthrow conditions. I take it that this radically benefits people with all kinds of different economic relationships to the economic world. And we know on an individual level that's changing all the time anyway. So it would be impossible to even maintain a political constituency if you're tracking individuals. No, instead you can have a class politics that seeks to overturn current conditions because they artificially produce poverty and privation, anarchic production, because they're driving us toward an intolerably bad world. And I therefore endorse a class politics. And by class politics, I mean that I'm endorsing a form of economic democracy. It's just the movement to overturn autocracy in the economy. And I take it that that's a class politics. That it just, and everything else doesn't matter, right? Because everything else is a form of blackmail within the party. And most of the class analysis that I've encountered in my life or the class worries that I've encountered in my life have been in the context of policing, they would say that because of their background. I mean, a dear friend of mine, for example, we were debating, and we were having and I took some position, and immediately I was like, well, you're not political. You're a professor. Mm-hmm. Where political had to mean some version of a member of the working class. So I don't know.
So you think definition of political, but because I'm like, actually, objectively speaking, by sociological concept, the least likely group to participate in anything political is actually a person in the bourgeois sociological definition of working class, lower middle class. Like,
always has been. Was Marx a member of the working class?
No,
I don't know. No, I guess no.
But no,
was he poor?
Yeah, I mean, like, he's poor. He sometimes acts like a petty bourgeoisie. Sometimes acts like a fucking lumpen. Despite his disgust at them.
The drinking, for example.
Marx is drinking. And people are always like, well, lumpen don't have that concentration. And I'm like, well, he had the concentration enough to write Capital. and yet also was pretty fucked up. I mean, like Mark, if you read like all of the biographies, I always talk about Marxist carbuncles, and I have a friend who shames me about that. It's like, that's not important. I'm like, but it kind of is, actually, like, to think about how this person is producing while they aren't, what their limits are. Because you ask people what social class is Marx in, and it is not clear at all, because he's also not bourgeois. He's not management to bourgeois like Engels. He's not a professor. He is sometimes a journalist, but not consistently. Sometimes he's basically the research aide subsidized by Engels, who keeps Marx's family in a house and Marx drunk.
That's right. I mean, it's basically it's a form of blackmail, right? And a form of bona fides to try to get credentials for yourself that are pseudo credentials. Well, I would know. I mean, I've experienced this in the past too. I mean, for example, I'll encounter colleagues that don't share my Marxist commitments, and they will. One of the obvious objections is, well, I came from a genuinely working class background, whereas you didn't, which is why, I'm some form of reformist and you're a revolutionary socialist. My revolutionary socialism is an expression of my economic position, however we're defining that. So there's another way in which
it's usually also your background, not even your role in production. like that's funny, because it's one of those things where I have a quote working class background. I have a mostly blue collar background, but that doesn't define my role in production. And my role in production is completely unclear to me, even though I do it. Like, when people have asked me my class, I'm like, I don't know actually where my class fits into this scheme.
No, it's mystery. Right, good. It should be a mystery, because the point, as I said before, the point is that it's a theoretical category. Its power is to describe how it can be that, given all of this variability and all of these, and general freedom, right? These political freedoms that were achieved to us by modern politics, how could it be that there could be these systematic inequities? Even if individuals fall in and out of the pattern, there are nonetheless these forces having to do with the economic structure that are operative and politically relevant. Well, let's call them classes, even though we know that they're not the kind of classes that we were used to refer to. Let's call them classes. Why? Because we can build a political discourse that makes sense around them. So, I mean, up until that political discourse stops making any sense, and it might well stop soon, in which case I'm not going to, socialism might still be struggled for, just on some different kind of terms. But to the extent that it has any political relevance, then we can continue to use it. But its political relevance is its only usefulness, which is not to say, and I don't mean to take over, but which is not to say that I think class is politically constituted. That is, there's a more recent sort of French, at least it appears to be as French, idea that you see a lot, that, the class in itself becomes the class for itself by virtue of its political alignment. So the moment that I enter the party is when I really become a member of the working class. I got to know it in order to be a member of the class. Well, this is the worst kind of blackmail, right? I mean, first of all, how do you know that you really know it? And is it you that does the knowing? You get into philosophical arguments about that sort of thing. That can't be it either. It can't be just it. So I think it's politically relevant and interesting for politics, and definitely for the struggle for socialism, but not as an analytic category. And it certainly shouldn't be a way of policing one another and shaming one another, in Marxist circles.
Well, I mean, it's a funny thing that even anarchists will sometimes throw at us and be like, well, until... I think the actual answer to this question is until Khrushchev, there's no one who's a leader in Marxism that would have come out of anything like a Marxist definition of working class. Even someone like Stalin, who grew up poor at parts of his life, but not all of it, and then, had certain advantages over certain other people in Georgia, and others does not fit the working class. I mean, he's... And in a rough sense, he's some D-class A former priest from a peasant background with a rich dad. I mean, and you see these categories get harder and harder to deal with. You have the same thing with Mao. Mao's from a middle class peasant family, a category that doesn't even make sense in the modern world, but it's basically a medium sized landowner. Ironically, when Mao's doing his little definition of class and class origins, the definition of peasant who would be the equivalent of a kulak has like 1 acre or whatever the Chinese measurement is larger than his father did. True fact. So it's
1 inch bigger.
Like, so it's you see these sort of opportunistic redefinitions of class. It's particular to Maoism, but it's not unique to Maoism, because all these also come up in the Soviet context, partly because in the Soviet context, the initial revolution is launched before, because I had someone telling me, like, the Tsarist empire proves the decline of the rate of profits to fall and Grossman and the Russian, and I'm like, Russian capitalism was limited to Moscow. Like, you know, and like St. Petersburg, like there's basically 2 industrial cities, and that was it. Like, what are you talking about capitalist conditions and the Tsarist empire? Like, my God, like, you know,
people are really trying to do the decline of, like, the Grossman final breakdown stuff about Russia. There's just no way that works. First of all, Grossman isn't talking about one country at a time. He doesn't mean the French rate of profit. But anyway, we don't.
This methodological nationalism is also a later problem. But
he gives it up. He gives up at least the Bundism of his youth. You know.
Yes.
But anyway,
that's a whole nother thing to talk about Grossman. But the issue is that in all these theories, there becomes a problem. We talked a little bit about Marxist humanism. When Marxist humanists talk about how they have like this pure notion of working class until you actually get into their politics, and then they redefine it to mean what they call the advanced section of the proletariat, which is almost always either in the third world or it's whatever oppressed minority that you happen to define as being in the working class that represents his true interest, because they actually played the same game as everybody else about looking for a new revolutionary subject in the 60s. But instead of saying they were abandoning the proletariat, they redefined the advanced section of the proletariat to be another identity.
Yep, that's exactly what they did. And it can be, by the way, any other identity. It could be someone who's a national, you know, in an oppressed nation. It could be any number of subjugated minorities in the United States, of which there are any number given our perfectly bloody and oppressive history. It can be, I mean, you know, you can replace it with anything. That's the beauty, and I think that's why we got into this mess. It's so useful as a category, because it looks like a special interest group in democratic politics, that is, in parliamentary politics.
Right.
I don't mean to. Democratic is the wrong word, actually. In parliamentary politics.
Yeah.
And of course, that's the way we do politics. I mean, look, I'm a gay Marxist
where we do it the shitty way. Like, it's shitty sub-parliamentary politics, but whatever.
Well, yeah. Oh, I was gonna say it's currently speaking of a non-class entity. So it's currently Pride Month, and you should walk around the Pride Festival. It's just a series of, like, you know, I don't know, you know, salesmen and nonsense and depoliticized nonsense. You know, who in a major city isn't flying a rainbow flag now? Like, oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. I drive around the rich neighborhoods in my neighborhood.
Same here. There's always a Black Lives Matter sign and a fucking rainbow flag. And like, okay, now admittedly, I see a lot more rainbow flags now here in the west side of town too. And the west side of town is the poor and Hispanic part of town. Okay. But you know, it's where I live because that's where I can afford as a teacher. But
it's nothing. That politics is nothing to do with the revolutionary overthrow, you know, of first the state and then the building of a genuine democracy that includes economic institutions.
Yeah,
right? I take it that's not a species of one of these identity politics struggles.
I mean,
it's non-parliamentary,
right? And I think that's what people need to get. I think that's why for example, when there's the Elite Capture book by who's the guy? I can't say his name. Has an African name. He's associated with the DSA. I'll actually look it up real fast. I'm probably going to mispronounce it because, like I said, I believe he has. It would be Ufumi o Tiwo, I believe.
Okay.
And he basically, like, from a more woke, social democratic, comes to the same conclusion that Adolf Reed did 10 years ago, that identity politics is inherently minoritarian in a way that actually prompts elites to adopt it as an edge in the fight, in the kind of social capital fight between different kinds of elites. Now, what's interesting about this is sociologically it's true, but it says nothing about class, actually. It doesn't even say anything about class in the bourgeois framework, which is something that I think people, when people posit this as an answer to the problem, I'm like, well, yes, it is. This is a debate between elites who want advantage, but like very easily, and in fact, I have seen this in real life, people have also tried to do, and I'm going to call out names here. There's an episode of Chapo Trap House where Amber A. Lee claimed that she was not PMC, and I guess it was because even though she has a podcast job that is lucrative sometimes, and she's sometimes on it, and she generally works at NYU, which according to the definition of PMC that I've ever heard would make you inherently PMC.
Can't even step foot on campus without becoming PMC momentarily.
Right, exactly. So then you have, so you're redefining it to mean part of your background, right? But only in the case of for you. And so this again becomes actually a way to differentiate yourself amongst other internal fights. And the reason why we talk about elites is elite is a relative category in any scenario. Like you can always talk about elites no matter what. You could talk about elite workers, frankly. Like elite is just a statistical strata that you kind of arbitrarily assign a certain number to and go. Like, you know, the elite, like the top 20% of anything is elite. So
by whatever measure is relevant to whatever discussion we're having.
Exactly.
In which case we're trying to replace a politics of economic emancipation with some other kind of a politics.
Right. It's usually a politics of social capital, a politics of class habitus, a politics of all kinds of stuff. A way to sneak in culture war battles one way or the other without actually saying you're doing it. By claiming you're above the culture war, you're just representing class politics, even though mysteriously the class values somehow just look like yours. You know, that trick, that neat trick, and it's a trick that we have to admit Marxists have done for a long time. Like it's not new.
No, it's not. No. Well, look, no political tradition is more laden with its own sins than ours. But
yes, that's not fair. Like, we are struck with the baggage of ourselves.
I think that if you talk to someone that, you know, sort of rank and file the DSA and you said, listen, you know, I don't think you're in a class and I don't think I'm in a class. You know, I think that there are classes that are operative at the level of society, and that's an interesting, you know, heuristic category to sort of like get you to a critique of political economy. You know, I don't want to throw out the word entirely. Actually, I want to preserve the word in some key instances. I think if you said that to someone like you're not in a class and I'm not in a class, your average DSA rank and file is just not. It's going to say, well, you've destroyed our politics. You destroy the ground of our politics. What we're trying to do is we're trying to reorient politics around a class first, you know, struggle. And so that reveals the usefulness of class for many, which is to make intelligible their politics. Well, I take it that if it's about the politics of personal self-interest, you know, there are better arguments you can make about your personal investment in a less poor, anarchic, you know, poisonous society. Right. It is, I mean, you know,
that's the essence of proletarianization. There's two things that drive proletarianization. in Marx. But one of them is objective, and that's more and more people are pushing the conditions of the working class as an analytic category that you exist primarily in. And I use all those caveats to say, like, no, you're not, like, I think David Harvey was actually good about this when he talked about this once. Like, I am a worker in this scenario. I also do have some strategic investment in capital because I come from a certain class, has access to a 401k. Does this determine my consciousness? And the answer is clearly no. Like that. And in fact, the history of Marxism is unintelligible if you think it determines your consciousness. So your idea, what I find interesting about your idea is it's not just going to piss the Marxist-Leninists off. It's not just going to piss the old Marxist humanists that you used to be one of off. It's not going to piss social democrats off. It's going to piss even left comms off who are like Anton Pannekoek and obsessed with authentic proletarian culture and proletarian science and stuff like this.
You know what I'm doing right now is I'm writing a book review of this lovely, wonderful new translation that we're getting. We're getting such great translations these days. One of them is a guy whose name I'm forgetting, but is of a pamphlet really called "Art in the Working Class" by Alexander Bogdanoff. Bogdanoff is an infinitely fascinating character, but one of the things that he argues for is for the emergence of a genuinely proletarian poetry, and that genuinely proletarian poetry will spring forth from a perfectly realized proletarian self-consciousness, and that culture that arises not just in poetry but in all of the arts, which is a reflection of a worldview that is emerging, will become the dominant worldview in a socialist future. This is that's a perfectly culturalist idea of what it means to move from one kind of society to another kind of society. It has the benefit of bypassing the need to completely transform the home and workplace.
Right. Yeah. So very little needs to change. And
except for the poetry, which is genuinely proletarian.
I mean, it's one of these things where Bogdanoff is instructive to me because he gets, in both his pushing the proletarian culture beyond itself and his God-building cultural enterprise, and his prolet cult building enterprise, which actually, to me, these two notions are at odds with one another. To move beyond the capitalist consumption of working class while also celebrating proletarian culture. I mean, it's the same kind of problem I used to have with Raymond Williams, which is interesting, but I remember his stuff about proletarian culture, and then I would be like, yeah, but do you mean culture made by proletarians to consume? Or do you mean the culture the proletariat makes itself? And he equivocates all the fucking time. And I realized that there's no way not to, actually. So, like, you talk about, like, you and I's differences on this, and I'm not sure that we are that different. I also will agree, and I've done videos on this, actually, that we need to have a Marxist notion of class, but that we should not go around and be like, oh, no, that's not class politics. That's whatever. And I'm like, no, like, when someone's talking about bourgeois notions of class, they don't mean what we do because they're not using our analytic. But what they're talking about actually has meaning. And we have to address that. And often we have to, when we're dealing with statistical arguments or whatever, kind of deduce with the caveat that we know that Marxism's not talking about the same thing. It's talking about an analytic driver. So this brings us to our old dead friend, Eric Ollenwright.
Yes.
Yeah, the late Eric Ollenwright, who we began by talking about my misguided attempt with a Moxahu of interviewing him, which led to a 3-hour mess. And the reason why it's lost is it took me so long to edit that I didn't finish it before the computer died when I was moving. That's the moral of the story.
Heartbreak.
But he talks interestingly. I think he has an insight that I think is actually useful, and then does a whole lot of other stuff that I think is useless. And the initial insight when he says in the beginning, the analytic driver of capitalism is still describable in proletarian and bourgeoisie, but the individual experience of class is absolutely not. And I'm like, I underlined that and I was like, duh. Like Even though that's obvious, Marxist, not Marx, have issues with this, because it's supposed to be the contradiction's supposed to be embodied, felt, and lived in and understood from the standpoint of the working class as both a subject and as an individual for most Marxists. And the last thing to me is a category error. Like, the individual does not experience the world as their class subject, even if it defines their subjectivity, blah, 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 blah. That's not how you experience the world. You do not experience the world as your class category, because you do not exist at that level of abstraction. That doesn't mean that level of abstraction is not in some way real. And that is the Marxist thing that people don't seem to get.
Consciousness, the consciousness in class consciousness cannot be the same kind of consciousness that that the Zen monk is trying to calm and move abstractly away from. If they're versions of the same idea, we're in nightmarish trouble. Not only because we've come really close to becoming a religion that's trying to get you to become who you really are or something, but also because that version of consciousness is this philosophic, psychological, on this side of my face, as one of my professors used to say, kind of consciousness. Well, that's just not what we can mean by class consciousness, which is an explicit commitment to a certain political project that we've all gathered together in order to have some strategy of realizing. That's all I need to mean by consciousness in that case. I know that I'm committed to X, which isn't an expression of my mindedness, which is affected by all kinds of things. I mean, I don't know. The discourse of mind is just not relevant to the progress, to the progress of Marxism.
Yeah. This was actually something that I fundamentally realized early on. And I'm going to sound like Michael Heinrich here for a second, but I realized that there was no such thing as worldview Marxism, in the sense of the fact Marx doesn't ever articulate an explicit theory of mind. And if you think there is a worldview Marxism, you have to fill that gap. And what most people do, actually now, because of historical tradition more than anything else, we fill it in with Freudianism, even though everybody else has moved on. But originally we were filling it in with Freudianism because that was the up-to-date subjective science of the time. Now we fill it, like, the idea that like someone would fill it in with like cognitive behavioral theory plus sociology plus, and I sometimes try to, but I also realize that that is not a question that is answered in Marx, because that is not what Marx is talking about. Marx doesn't feel like he needs to answer that because there's other answers to it, and he feels like it's actually already mostly been worked out. And it's just, it's like one of the things, people will bring up the Heinrich thing and we'll be like, well, Marx has a shitty argument for the falling rate of profits. And yes, he actually does. It's not super great.
That's why we have Grossman.
Yeah, it's also the point is like he was playing with it like this, trying to figure it out in a draft that he never released, that he wrote very early on, that is in a messy form, and he didn't feel like he needed to justify it because every serious political economist at the time accepted it, including people who aren't even in the Eurocentric political economic tradition. It's observed by Ibn Khaldun. Like, there's a whole chapter in there about declining rates of profits in certain kinds of competition and declining returns on gold. Like, in 13th century Arab sociology. Like, come on. Like, it's there. So Marx doesn't feel, there's many things Marx doesn't feel the need to argue for. Labor theory of value is another one. Everyone accepted it. He also didn't think it was empirically verifiable. I think he laughed at the idea that you could, that it was an analytic category.
You know who gives us a really good model, despite himself, for understanding how the inherited concept of class gets us into blind alleys, is Adorno himself, in a book, in my favorite of his books, which is The Stars Down to Earth, which is his.
Oh, that's a good book,
take
actually.
on the.
That's a take on the
it's
cult,
great.
right? Like.
Yes, and it's about the Los Angeles Times horoscope page. Now, so think about how astrology works. I've had the maybe good, maybe bad fortune of being on plenty of first dates with people who take astrology really seriously. And what's its form? Its form is by virtue. Well, when you have these offensive politics, you're not, doctors and lawyers not lining up to. Okay.
Yeah. I was about to say, it's like there's a certain category of people that are into you, and it's like anarchist anthropologists and normies who don't ask you your politics because they think you'll freak them out. So
that's right, actually, and maybe I'm decided that's the safest route. But no, so how does astrology work, right? The logic is there's an objective. Let's say there's a zodiac sign that you have in itself, right? Despite you knowing anything about it, you might be an Aries by virtue of objective conditions of your birth, having to do with your background, incidentally. And these you can become conscious of them. You can plan your life according to them, but they're going to be operative whether or not whether or not you're conscious of them or not.
You don't need to believe in them for them to work in theory.
Exactly right. So it's unlike Tinkerbell in that way. That's basically how many Marxists think class works. It's just like astrology, and that cannot be correct. At least I won't abide that being correct.
So, I mean, this leads us into a kind of cul-de-sac, though. I mean, and the cul-de-sac, I mean, here is like, at the very moment where we're happy that class politics come up again, we've also been like, yeah, and the moment you interjected trying to match people to classes, you fucked it up. And that
right.
Sounds like we're saying that this is not an empirical concept. And in a sense that no analytic concept is empirical, it's not an empirical concept, but that's true for I literally got in an argument with an MMTer about the rate of interest being natural, and I'm just like, there's no such thing as a natural rate of interest, and your argument's semantic, and like, no, totally under these conditions, and I'm like, these conditions never actually exist, so it's a semantic argument, and like, and I'm like, so you might have a point, you might even be correct according to the stipulations of what you mean by natural, but if you just say the natural rate of interest is X, I'm going to be like, there's no such thing as a natural interest rates do not occur in nature. And I think this is actually similar with class, where like we can judge our class analytic to me by what it can predict in aggregate, but not anything that it predicts in an individual. And the MCM circuit is still predictive to me in aggregate. So I guess this brings us back to Eric Olin Wright, though, because one of the things Eric Olin Wright does is he tries like, well, Weber, blah, blah, blah. You were not going to go into his weird politics, and Weber wasn't an SPD guy, gets disillusioned with it, then becomes, I don't know what the hell he really becomes, really.
He invents sociology in order to evade Marxism.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, actually, not kind of, almost explicitly.
Almost explicitly.
With Weber, there are I think one of the interesting things about Weber that's both tragic is some of his intellectual grapplings about like instrumental reason and stuff are actually very useful for Marxists to take on. But you have to admit the entire project was aimed at trying to make more concretize this analytic. And by that, I mean, that's a very weird way of saying it, but he's trying to make the analytic more empirical and less analytic. So instead of talking about things dialectically and then letting the concepts emerge as useful analytics within this historical dialectic, as mirrors of things in nature, as the way Marx would see them, you have this idea that we go searching for the category dialectically, but then define it as soon as we find it empirically, and then operate off of any sort of description. And that's a fundamentally different way of going about things. It also leads to different conceptions, and it leads to weird shit. And I'm a scholar of Christopher Lasch. I love Christopher Lasch's early work. I'm ambivalent about his late work. But one of the things that I'm always complaining about with my co-author, who's like, oh, it's not a big deal. But I'm like, Lasch doesn't have a coherent theory of what class is. And it becomes increasingly in his work a cultural identifying marker that is vaguely related to where you are in the means of production, but not even totally related to that. And by the time you get to the revolt of the elites in his late work, he's literally positing an alternative history of what the working class could have been if it had not industrialized, as if it had a choice. Like, because of the nebulous nature of his class analysis, and he's including people like sharecroppers and artisans in the 17th century and all these as like who the working class and the working class tradition should pull from, because he's redefining it. In his early works, he more or less has a Marxist definition, but is vague on it because, like I said earlier, he's pulling from this Paul Sweezy, like, well, the MCM circuit's kind of done. We're not talking about class conflict in the same way anymore. We just need like a class politics that valorizes the working class is what it says, which again, in my mind, over the course of his career, he turns it into a contra identity politics that is itself an identity politics.
Yeah, it's sad how that works. So let's imagine a book like Classes, which we've all had on our shelves for years, and say, okay, so what's the motivation and what might be an alternative version of the project? I take it that the motivation is, well, how close is the revolution? Well, if you think that the revolution is going to be driven forward by people's class consciousness, then let's figure out what their objective class positions are. That will determine the rate at which they can become class conscious in the way we expect them to, and therefore we'll have some idea of how close the revolution is as the process by which people become, enter the class and then become class conscious is predictable. I take it that that's this sociological, it's a classic sociological mistake. It pays too much attention to people. And if you take the people away, it all becomes clearer. I think instead of looking at how the classes emerge, look at individual sectors and the mode of production. That is, which sectors are most amenable to socialization and why? Where is technological advancement concentrated and why? What technologies, efficiency technologies are crowding out other forms of technological advancement? So, for example, one of the characteristic features of technological innovation in capitalism is that it's always done with an eye toward reducing labor time. But it's just not the only kind of efficiency. For example, hardly ever will you get a manner of production or a way of producing a good that produces a much higher quality good with many more use values with exactly the same number of workers. That's an unusual form of development in capitalism. It counts as growth in the forces of production. Of course it does. It expands the number of use values. It can be a much higher quality good, for example. That expands its use value. So we can all get wealthier through efficiency technologies, but it's just not the kind of efficiency that competitive markets tends to select for. So, which is all by way of saying, if we were tracking at a granular level, which sectors, which technologies, and what technologies are really being left out that a socialist form of organizing the economy wouldn't, then we're talking in concrete terms, I think, about how proximate the revolution is. That is, how close can we get to a world in which the dominant relations of production are socialized, are a form of socialism. So I take it that sociologists, and Eric and Lauren included, they're distracted by people.
Right, because they're taking people as somehow. I think often to me this is a part of the whole fallacy problem. Like, you're trying to, because someone functions as a role in this abstract thing that exists in aggregate, you're trying to backdraft that to figure out how it would apply to the individual, and ultimately, yes, in some sociological ways it actually does, but that doesn't have much political import whatsoever. And then my favorite game that like social democratic people do with the properly political thing and all this, and this is a new development, but that's something I've seen since 2016, is the worker thinks like me problem. Is because workers are hard to get objective data on the way we define them in Marxism, because the data kept by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is doesn't use our criterion. It uses a bunch of criterions, but not ours. And because ours doesn't really apply to individuals anyway, the the way that they do this is to say, well, workers all, you know, and even Chomsky does this. Workers believe X because X Pew poll shows this, and we have this demographic of Y, but also workers are the least understood. Workers, even as defined in sociological terms as blue collar and lower paid unskilled white collar labor, who make less than $60,000 a year in contemporary terms. You know, that's the way it's usually going to be defined in like bourgeois statistics. The thing is, those people don't vote, and and also in large numbers they do vote actually, but not in large numbers ever. And the polls that take their opinion define everything differently each time, and you get different results depending on how you ask the question, who's asking the question, what way they're asking the question, what someone smells like that minute, whether or not someone had a shower before. I mean, like the number of completely arbitrary and subjective factors that actually can change the answer to a Pew poll means that these questions don't tell us much, but they're useful for projecting, because I can always find a poll stat to back up my opinion that workers believe X. And so you'll hear, you know, the people over at Compact Magazine talking about like workers class whatever is really like Catholic and blah blah blah, and then, you know, there are no blue-haired transgender lesbian workers, which is a ridiculous statement if anyone's ever been to a 7-Eleven in a city. You know, just to put that out there. Yeah, there's guys that look like they eat chew and wear camo. There's also some blue hairs working there too, of indiscriminate gender. So it's, I mean, this doesn't mean anything is my point. Like, so you can always, it becomes like proof texting the Bible. I can say anything is already a class politics because of these vague definitions, and because the class I'm talking about is the class that has the least predictable political engagement, honestly, so that I can then just project whatever onto them.
This brings up a wonderful point. So one of the most frustrated I've been recently with the left publishing world was I guess Jacobin did this. Jacobin did this survey where they took.
My God.
Do you remember this?
Yes.
Yeah, they did this survey, and they were trying to survey the working class. I mean, this is how completely beholden this it's not even revolutionary strategy. This reformist strategy is to not even electoralism, to put like the peculiarly corrupt American brand of electoralism. They're trying to do their own kind of pollsterizing, really. And so anyway, they take I guess they take people without college educations, or they track people by education, and that's their analog for class. Just on its face, that, by the way, should tell you something about the uselessness of the category, is that you can't find a marker that's better than your level of education. But let's leave it at that. Anyway, it was all about what they think. I take it that a Marxist shouldn't care at all about any of that. First of all, because the demarcating, but even if you bought the whatever demarcating criteria they were using, it still doesn't like matter.
Physical labor is magic thing. I have an anarchist friend that I respect and do a lot of co-work with, but he literally thinks that, like, well, blue collar labor is separate, but then he goes and includes unskilled service work as blue collar, and then I'm like, so the only magic here is whether or not something requires an education and is cartelled or not, and with the exception of government jobs, which are cartelled but are semi-skilled, but you don't want to factor those in because that would fuck up your analogy. Or you think that physical labor is somehow magic, like, but not in relation to commodity production, just in relation to, like, you know, the value of your work, whether or not you work with your hands or your mind, which I find super frustrating, because that is something Marx explicitly says is bullshit. It's not even implied.
Right.
Like,
I have to make it with my hands. I have to make it with the hands, or else I'm alienated. It's just the, no, can't be the case. Well, first of all, what the working class thinks cannot be the baseline of your politics.
right.
It just has to be. I mean, first of all, we're not quite all, although an increasing number of us are, and this should be a great hopefulness to us because they're not all on the left, but an increasing number of Americans are explicitly anti-state. Like, I mean, have written off partisan politics and want to overthrow the Washington regime. I take that to be all to the good. Whether or not that's an expression of their individual class identity is absolutely beside the point. But the point is, I mean, you're never going to get the answer that you want by trying to meet the working class where it is. Not only just because the Marxist movement is a force of persuasion and not one of trying to decide what kinds of messaging is going to be appropriate for your electoral campaign, precisely because we oppose the state anyway. But also, because you're never going to know who your natural political constituency is by virtue of their education or any number of other criteria that you could draw on in order to track this working class.
And I think that's kind of crucial to deal with. So to go back into Eric Olin Wright's book a little bit, so you have classes and you have understanding classes. And understanding classes is one I've read more recently, so I'm going to talk about that one. So you have that first inclination that I highlighted that I think he was correct about, like the people's experience of class is more like what Pierre Bourdieu is describing than what Marx is describing. But Pierre Bourdieu's not predictive of anything and not predictive to the driving conflict in society, which is true. Like, I think that's objectively true. Also, it doesn't deal with factors like social capital and this, that, and the other. And that's when I'm like, okay, yeah, that's also true. That's not relevant to my politics, though. Like, my politics is not about, like, for example, my own personal social capital is all over the place. Like, my taste in movies and films is objectively snobbish. My taste in, like, comic books is objectively, like, proletarian, i.e., I read them because I think they're brain candy and I don't care. But I don't have snobbish attitudes about people who enjoy things that, like, stupid, I call them stupid, but stupid movies like Jurassic Park. I don't think you're bad for liking that. I sometimes like those dumb movies too. My point is, though, my cultural habitus is all over the place. There are things you can predict from it. There are things you can predict about, like my ability to move between social classes and categories because of specific instances in my life, but they don't match up with the thing Marx is describing, actually. They don't. And that used to really bug me. And then I did, it was actually when I was responding to Eric Olin Wright, when I'm like, oh yeah, the class as the driver of the conflict in capital still objectively applies because the MCM objectively applies, and unlike the rest of communism, it's actually predictive. It's the only thing that I can pull from Marx that is predictive, but it also the only thing that we really should insist should be, because it is a scientific analytic. It is not empirical science. It is with this analytic, we can see X and we can figure out the likelihood of Y. And we can. Actually, we can see that there's class distinctions, political categories that flows from this, etc., and so forth. But if you try to retro throw them back down on the individual level, they do start to break down. And my other way of talking about this is what Eric Olin Wright was trying to head off, I think, was what we ended up getting anyway with the resurrection of the PMC thesis, which is the idea that another class or some intermediate class that you have more interaction with, what Olin Wright would see, the class that dominates you versus the class that exploits and controls you, would be, or what he would say, the strata, not actually a separate class, but whatever, would actually be the dominating thing people respond to. And what we see with the PMC thesis is because also the bourgeoisie is structuralized now in a very real way, where it's hard to find the actual entrepreneurs who singularly own a business in this heroic early 19th century way. And so then you start positing what right-wingers have always done and what left-wingers have started to do recently, as like the people managing everything are actually in charge because they're the only people we can identify. And as a specific group of people and not as an analytic category. And this is a vast difference from Marx and Engels, or even Bakunin, because Bakunin also talks about like you can't hold the individual as representative of their class, even in the case of the bourgeoisie. Like the individual bourgeoisie might be a good person, might even be on your side. This is from Bakunin, not Marx. Marx says similar things actually, but that's not here nor there. But that the structure is the problem.
That's right. That's right. You know, the Brecht has this beautiful quotation where he says, where he's remarking on, I forget who it is, some other one of these sort of exile intellectuals who is describing a possible novel plot about a wealthy, based on the founding of the Frankfurt School. So you know, wealthy wheat magnate decides that there's terrible suffering in the world.
That's only funny if you know the history of the Frankfurt School, though.
Well, right. So this wealthy guy, he's decided that he wants to alleviate, he wants to respond to the suffering in society, and so he founds an institute to study the origin of social blight, which Brecht points out, of course, is himself.
Yeah,
I take it. Brecht doesn't mean when he says that one individual guy is responsible for any individual person's poverty. That cannot be what he's talking about.
No.
But it's a good quotation anyway. Isn't that nice?
Yeah, it's great. It's actually funny when I think about it, because that also fits the whole observation that we see about you going back to the PMC on PMC violence thesis, that all the PMC debates involve people who ostensibly belong to this strata or class, of which they can't really even define, and of whom they're always saying everything is bad is from, and yet they are also almost always from that sector of society. Like I can't think of a person who's a major.
Structurally so, right? I mean, this is the thing I've always wanted to ask Catherine, which is how do you explain yourself? How do you explain that you, a member of the PMC, are able to know, is that the class in itself becoming the class for itself? Is that truly how it works? But what's worse is that the PMC debate is a tiny niche in theory, in social theory, and as we've said before, that's a bureaucracy. That's a form of knowledge hoarding. They're in, what there are is experiencing bureaucracy from the inside, and that does suck. But bureaucratization, well, it has everything to do with the mode of production and the distribution, of the division of labor within the firm and the technologies that are most amenable to those forms of the division of labor. It's not a class analysis. When we talk about the failures of bureaucracy or the pitfalls of bureaucracy, we're not doing
it's a social organization critique. It's not a class critique.
Not about class.
And the problem is a lot of these things, like class is a broad category going all the way back to the 1840s into what we should call classical liberalism and classical socialism, but we don't, because libertarians ruin those words for everybody. Yeah, I mean, I had this back when I was a right winger, actually, so 20 years ago, I had this whole thing where I was actually going up against libertarians and saying, like, look, no, like, socialists also come out of classical liberalism, as do pretty much everyone but Demestre and like Pat Buchanan. And even he's questionable. He might secretly be a liberal. and it was, for me, it was a way out of like distancing myself from liberalism, but it was also this is before I was a Marxist, so this was not my attempt to like stay Marxist. The way a lot of people do, like you see, like Marxism is like more advanced liberalism, or the completion of the liberal revolutions into the communist one, or this, that, and the other. In a very abstract sense, it's kind of true, although they're misconstruing quotes from people who still lived under monarchies.
and who lived in completely different economies in terms of like just basic efficiencies in the mode of production. I mean, I hate to bring it back. Look, I'm the cold stream technological determinist sort of guy, which has the great benefit of not getting into these sort of like into these blackmail like debates about who's in and who's out, or whether or not it's an identity or not, or any of this. But it does make people nervous, right? But I mean, that seems the most obvious way in which we have to distance ourselves from the inherited political discourse of a society that just didn't look like ours. It is true that Marxist political economic categories are relevant to a broad swathe of time, but it's not the case that our politics need to be descended or genealogically related to political struggles in the context of an autocracy in the 18th century,
or even the end of that autocracy in the 20th. Like that's, you know, that for all of the way in which you and I both argue that the Second International period is maybe the most analogous thing to now, and unfortunately, if things continue, maybe we'll be back at the First International period before this is all over. But
it's just Benjamin Button. That's what it is. Is where we are.
Like around 1950, we decided to age backwards. But yeah, I'm dangerously close to capital decadence or hyper regressive theory. But whatever. There is a sense in which I think those things are super illuminating, and there's also a sense in which I think they're super confusing, because I'm like, yes, and the dispersion of socialism, and there being no clear social movement, and the workers' movement seeming to have been defeated from its 1950s form. The early 20th century is the most illustrative, but in terms of technological development. Like, I've even talked to people like, I don't know why the fuck we're debating market socialism and labor tokens anymore. We have computers now.
We could easily do this. Oh, that's the saddest thing. The saddest thing about the artificially poor society that we live in is that we have the technical capabilities of organizing an economy. That seems transparently the case. We could obviously be more efficiently using our resources. We already
do organize our economy.
Well, also, yeah, that's right. We needn't have Cybersyn fantasies, need we? Right. That's a good point.
Otherwise, monetary, fiscal, and corporate planning would not be a thing.
Right. That's right. And in fact, a lot of the computing and a lot of the great minds in society are devoted to using computers to do crazy things with analytics in the financial markets, which are now happily destroying themselves. By the way, welcome to the final crisis, man. Are you enjoying the first seeds? The final this is it's song lyric time. I'm convinced capitalism died 10 years ago, and the coyote is looking down only now.
You and I are. This is a distinction between us, but it is a mild one, because I am also in the feeling that I don't know that we can know that we're in the final crisis, but we are at the end of neoliberalism for sure. For sure. And I think neoliberalism has been dead for 10 years, and that may or may not mean that capitalism is dead.
Okay, maybe I'm being a little flip.
You're being optimistic, is what you're being. But
yeah, okay, optimism of the whatever the appropriate thing to have optimism of is.
Yeah, because you're like, final crisis, yay. Also, do you know how much it's going to suck to live through that? But
oh yeah, it is totally gonna. I know it's so comforting to know that I will die as a result of a reactionary's bullet and not of climate change. It's very comforting, I find. How I go to sleep at night. No, look,
it's a quicker death. I mean,
the largely classic model, which is like socialism and the workers' movement, right? And merging those two things in order to create the classic social democratic revolutionary strategy. I don't even think that needs to be abandoned, because who says that the workers' movement is about class? I take it that, first of all, there's nothing that's inherently, everyone knows this, right? Nothing's inherently anything about the labor movement. The labor movement can be as reactionary as it is progressive. It doesn't have a necessary political valence. But I take it socialism has to be first, which is to say, convincing someone that they ought to be politically committed to socialism need only mean convincing them that that the economic tendencies and the state that supports those economic tendencies is driving us to privation.
Right. And you can, what I have argued recently in regards to this, and I want your maybe take on this maybe a little bit, is that the tendency of socialists to tail either left wing of capital, aka the Democrats, or the right wing of capital, aka the Republicans and their various reactionary hordes, to use scary language, is actually unnecessary, particularly now. Because wedding yourself to either one of those chains weds yourself to managing the downturn of capital. So you're like, and I actually think this is a fundamental mistake that the second Bernie Sanders movement did. I don't think the first Bernie Sanders movement is guilty of it, but I do think the 2021 is. And that is because Bernie did not distance himself from the Democratic Party as much. For reasons that were politically expeditious and were even justifiable by a strategy. I'm not like wagging my finger at him the way some people do, but I was totally afraid that it would do the following. It would interject a feeling of vitality into a deracinated managerial politics of late moribund capitalism that can't figure out what to do next, by making it seem like there was a debate around socialism reemerging when there actually was not any real debate in the actual centers of power, and it was something that was being capitalized on to revitalize a certain politics. You will notice that this doesn't require any class involvement at all. Like,
sure,
this is not to get the working class sold on Democrats. This is not what this is about. I also don't think this is what a lot of this whole workerist national conservative movement is about, because it's not aimed, their writings are not aimed at workers, like whatever that means. Their writings are aimed at intellectuals. So its goal is not what it seems to be on some level. Well, this means that right now we actually have the ability to stand apart and say, look, we told you all this shit sucks, and you don't have to listen to them anymore. Like, either side of these fools, look at what they're doing. One side can't even stop, various reactionary legal rulings, despite the fact they control two branches of government. They haven't even tried to do anything about the other one. Yeah. And when they had the power to for sure do it, they did not in 2007, 2008, 2009. Conversely, look at the other fools I don't know what they're doing. Like QAnon plus I hate bureaucracy, but I'm going to randomly expand it by weird reactionary things that require more and more state oversight on every single element of your life, while also claiming I hate the state. Like, we don't need to be wedded to either of those fucking teams. Like,
no, certainly not. No, the state. I mean, God, look, the state can't guarantee that the water coming out of the faucet isn't poisonous. It cannot make good on all of the productive capacity that lies for lack of productive investment, right? That lies fallow. It can't solve the housing crisis. It can't educate its population. It can't. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The state clearly cannot provide for the functions that this kind of society requires a state to provide, some sort of order.
Even basic,
things
like,
have gone wrong.
Order. When I've pointed out to people that, like, under the Supreme Court's own thing, going back to the 1980s, cops are not required to defend you or enforce the law by law. They're not actually required to do that. Like, there is no law that requires them to actually enforce the law or protect anybody.
That's a good point. I didn't actually realize that. I never looked for one, but that's a good point.
No, there's a Supreme Court ruling that says you can't sue them in civil court over this.
That's extraordinary. It's like that Seinfeld episode where they don't help.
Right. Well, which is why there's going to be no legal consequences for Uvalde, because it's not illegal. like it's not even suable. So so I'm like, the state doesn't do shit. Like, nope. And this is and at the side point, this is the biggest state that has ever existed.
What do you mean by that?
The actual amount of resources that go into this state, and these are abstract resources, admittedly, and the amount of people whose futures are tied in with the modern development state are larger than it has ever been, even though fewer people work for the state than they did under Keynesianism. But if you look at both debt ratios, the amount of government involvement in general social life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's actually increased, particularly during the neoliberal period. And even to the point that the state is, even the formal state, despite a decline in overall employees, makes up a larger section of the economy. And so when I say this is the biggest state that's ever existed and it can't do shit, I actually kind of mean it literally. Like, this is literally the biggest state apparatus with the most killing potential and codified legitimate use of force that a state can have in the history of fucking mankind. And it can't do things that some medieval societies could actually do.
Like build roads.
Yeah. And maintain water infrastructure. Like...
Right, and maintain the water and the bridges. I mean, it's extraordinary. So who would want to defend the state? Why should socialists want to defend the institutions? We can't go too far or else we're in a revolutionary situation, right? Well, of course, precisely. We're already in a revolutionary situation, if only because it will become intolerable to live in a society that has given itself over to anarchy and madness. Order will have to reassert itself. So I take that all socialists. I don't. Fighting words now. He's trying to exaggerate the differences artificially. How like a sectarian. I take it that that it is political expediency and not ultra left fantasizing that leads me to think that the correct political strategy in the present is to oppose the Washington regime as such.
Yeah, me too.
Down with Washington. Everyone's in favor of that.
I'm tired. I'm actually tired of being blamed. Like, I don't want to be blamed with the same fuckers who threw their lot in with the people who couldn't even protect Roe v. Wade, like, under their own watch. In fact,
that's right.
What I've been pointing out to people lately is, like, when you guys did the harm reduction arguments, everything got objectively worse, and the right actually got more powerful, even though you kicked them off social media. Absolutely.
Wow. Goodness God. That should be the other rule, by the way, for the fictional party of the future. Absolutely no social media, because we don't engage with the capitalist press. But, so the way I get in trouble, of course, in my day job is by having, of course, an intolerable opinion about the war in Europe, the horrifying, unlookable war in Europe. But because the line is
that we need peace, and I actually think that the similar
down with Washington, down with Moscow, down with Washington, down with Moscow, right? And everyone's like, what is he? It's like, well,
you can complain about us being opportunistically third campus in Vietnam, but which I wasn't alive, so you can't accuse me of that anyway. But nor do I tend to take that stance. But in regards to the current war, I'm always like, I literally actually think the Zimmerwald original meaning of revolutionary defeatism applies, not this redefinition where we pick a side in a camp, but the original meaning, which is like, we need peace even if it means both sides lose. Because that's what's going to be in the interest of the working class ultimately.
See, now I'm going to evoke Zimmerwald when I make this argument. That's exactly correct. It's about revolutionary defeatism. And we should not be in favor of the imperialist projects of our state. Why? Because it strengthens our state to the extent that they're successful. So we should wish for their... We also shouldn't be imperial
project of another state just because it's not us. Which is also, and while I could be convinced maybe of some defensive arguments about China, I don't know that actually you could convince me, but I could see it. I actually can somewhat see it. You can't convince me of that about non-USSR Russia. Like, that somehow it's because I've had people in my DMs and stuff send me like, why don't you even though you take a more humane line that's not pro-NATO, and I'm like, why the fuck would I be pro-NATO? My friends, like, that's ridiculous.
Pro-NATO.
But you don't talk about how, like, revolutionary defeatism, and I'm like, so you don't know what revolutionary defeatism means, is usually my response to that. Then I'll get like, well, Russian gas is clearly better for the environment, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, I don't know where you're getting this from. And it has nothing to do with class. You cannot
better for the environment.
It'll
be better for the class.
Like, I'm like, so I guess it is better than importing petrochemicals from the United States, but like, come on, like that bar is so pathetically low that it's like when people try to convince me that because of green stuff going in China that we shouldn't be worried about the fact that they're still having to prop up their coal industry and kick it out because they can't meet their green energy goals yet. People are like, well, but they're trying. I'm like, so what? Like, trying only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, my friend. Like, to use
and socialism only counts if they're able to overcome capitalism.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, sure, you can convince me. And actually, some people have convinced me that a large part of the Politburo in China actually really does want to overthrow capitalism, but they haven't done it. So, like whether or not they mean to do it isn't really the point. And
not relevant to defending the Chinese state. I cannot look around the world, and I really won't look around the world. I won't be made to look around the world trying to decide between states I want to defend and states I don't want to defend. This is certainly not what Kautsky did when he looked around the world. He was just trying to decide what's the better state. It was never the case.
Did either.
No, Lenin did either. Engels wasn't looking at Britain and being like, well, what we really need is just a lot of Britons. That clearly not. It's clearly the case that we want the revolutionary overthrow of these institutions, which are all interconnected, by the way. I mean, not just through military, but also through finance and through any number of international trade treaties. There's a global system of states, including China.
From the military protection of sea lanes relying on the United States military in a way that China has no interest in undoing yet, except in maybe in a small sphere of influence in the South China Sea, all the way to the fact that the insurance regimes of the entire world are still largely based in the U.S. and Britain, including stuff going out of China today. And you're going to tell me that a state has solved the problem of capitalism when it's still subordinate to larger capitalist infrastructure because it can maybe slap around and shoot one or two of its own bourgeoisie sometimes?
They don't even have their own higher education system, which you think of something to be an achievement of socialism. It's a
they don't have socialized medicine anymore. They got rid of it in 1978. So
they outsource their higher education to Australia and the United States and Europe. I mean, how many Chinese students are getting their higher education abroad, which should be, it should be unthinkable for a successful socialism. I mean, and of course, you can do the same thing with medicine. You could probably, no, obviously not. And that has nothing to do with class either.
No.
Look, the tall and the short of long and the short of it, all I'll say is,
I was my favorite thing was when Michael Roberts, a guy who I normally actually like, tried to figure out the class composition of the PRC and the CC and the CPC, and he was like, it's mostly engineering people. If you're complaining about a dictatorship of the PMC, it would also be true in China. There are slightly less billionaires involved than in our politics, but not a lot less. And he was like, but we can't say it's a bourgeois party because the bourgeois don't totally own it. And I'm like, Michael, by that strategy, I also can't say the United States has bourgeois politicians because most of the politicians are not formal members of the bourgeoisie. They're rich, but most of them aren't business owners, are whatever. Some of them come from that background, some don't, but
sure.
And they're increasingly rich, actually, increasingly very rich, but they're not rich from fucking capital either. Or at least not by starting businesses and running them or even owning significant amounts of stock in large corporations. That's not how they got there. So it's interesting to listen to these justifications about class origins and parties and whatever, particularly also when people are trying to sell me that socialism is in place. And I'm like, well, socialism is in place, and everybody's a worker anyway, right?
Right? Yeah, right. That's right. All equally a worker, in fact.
like, I'm sorry, you're not going to convince me that even if there are elements of bourgeois society, as Marx says in the Critique of the Growth program, that there's going to actually still be bourgeoisie and as a transition to socialism. Like, that seems to me like the minimum prerequisite is there's no bourgeoisie. Like,
and this is also true. I mean, this is also true of a lot of, Western Marxist theories of the Soviet Union. They're trying to look for class, and they're trying to demonstrate that, in fact, these are capital societies or some other form of capitalist society, some phase in the capitalist production, by virtue of existence of classes. Actually, Michael Roberts just the other day, or maybe not the other day, but for me the other day on YouTube, said that China isn't capitalist because it's avoided economic recessions.
Which is no longer true, by the way.
One, is no longer true. Two, so did we during COVID by doing this absurd sort of financial scheme.
Right. I've actually been pointing out the business cycle has applied to China since 2011. So, like, they have not had severe recessions, but they've had business cycle turndowns. It's just that they're coming down from such a high productivity rate. But by the way, we didn't have recessions between the Great Depression and the post-war contact because we had a very similar pattern of development, which is why everybody believed in bullshit like administrative class theory. Because if you looked at the class theory at the time, that it looked a lot like China now, and that seems like a okay deduction to make. Except you can't argue that it was a socialist society because that'd be absurd. So you have to come up with a new theory to justify the fact, even though profit exploitation is what the social welfare state is based off of. So
totally.
Unless you're some weird Keynesian who thinks that somehow liquidity fixes that.
So do we solve this for the left? Have we? I think this is the moment. Historians will say that this was the moment when the class got more sophisticated on the Marxist left.
One hopes, but somehow I doubt people are going to listen to you or me when we say, like, class is not a thing that you are; it is a category in which you exist in, which is, and you cannot reduce yourself to it. And that's and unfortunately, that cuts against pretty much most politics in the socialist sphere. Going back to the First International, like, we're going back to Marx's lifetime where this is a debate. And a debate that Marx is kind of sketchy on, frankly. But we know he means something different. One of the things I was talking about, well, we know that Marx means something different because when most people tell me a dictatorship of the proletariat, the definition they give me, they don't know what Marx means. They're actually citing Blanqui without realizing it, and missing the fact that the whole debate about the dictatorship of the proletariat, one was, you have to suspend bourgeois law, otherwise they're going to use it to destroy you. But the other is that it didn't mean what Blanqui meant by it. That's why they used the term. Yeah. Like, because the idea of a dictatorship, I mean, like, Marx would accuse Blanqui of basically, like, you're trying to have a dictatorship for a class, not a dictatorship of a class. And a dictatorship of a class is just when only your class political assumptions can be manifest in politics, which we have seen with bourgeois order, because non-bourgeois truly pre-bourgeois political forms, they exist, but they have no real purchase in the larger sphere of things. They don't matter. Like, we're not really worried about monarchists taking over the United States. Like,
no, although there are some. There's this Yarvin character or whatever. There's lots on the right that are interested in monarchy. Fascinating. But anyway, that is, you know what that is? That's genuinely a class politics. That's a class politics. A politics that seeks to redefine juridical categories in society that match up to forms of social power and access to economic
and the form of social power being like this weird, doesn't even make sense, feudal conception, even though without any of the other feudal overlay. And then you have Marxists who pick this up and like, oh, we're not fighting capitalism, or Marxist and semi-Marxist like Yanis Varoufakis. I should not accuse him and disdain his good name or our good name by linking them together. But about like techno neo-feudalism. And I'm always like, this is like, the fundamental MCM circuit is either broken or it still applies. But what I can tell you does not apply is this idea that techno means that you can have a bunch of peasants who don't produce anything and don't grow food and don't produce energy. So why the fuck would you have them? Like, what would they serve in your techno neo-feudalism if you think that robots can do all of it? And the answer is nothing, and no one would do it because you'd be transforming most of the society into surplus population to overthrow you. Like, duh.
And we're already turning large swathes of the population into surplus population.
Yeah, and they are kind of very overthrowy. Like,
right, you know, not in the slightest. Yeah, you know, look, what is the class struggle? The class struggle is the struggle against artificial privation. It's the struggle, in fact, it's the political form in which our tradition has translated the adaptation to emerging technological trends in terms of an emancipatory democratic politics. I'm still completely married to that because I think that there's something in common with that. I do think that the way in which, you know, any number of things are produced, any number of things are, you know, are in fact used, a lot like housing, by the way, as housing has become more dense. We all live in these majority renter cities now, that it just makes a lot more sense, produces more order, produces more wealth for everybody if these things are democratically run. Maybe that makes me a council communist of some kind. But I take it that efficiency alone, efficiency now, not just labor time efficiency, efficiency in the broadest sense, meaning more use values for the same amount of work or less work, then, oh my goodness, right? That is a class struggle. Why? Because I understand a political economic imperative to overthrow the current state of affairs. And by the way, our primary enemy is everybody's enemy, the state that creates poverty, blight, and anarchy for all.
Right. And our primary solution is self-regulation. And yeah, this is where I'm also a dirty like, I'm not a council communist in that I don't go so far as say the Paul Maddock or John Appel Council or the ICC or whatever, who go, we don't need parties and we don't need, I'm not sure we need parties actually, but we don't need unions. And I'm like, I'm not letting the fucking labor bureaucracy have the union. I'm sorry.
No.
Like, so, you know, I don't go as far as that, but in the sense that I think radically like the inputs to society should involve everyone in society as fair as equal power stakeholders. No, we can't all do everything. Like when people like, there's still a class if there's still a separation of labor. I'm like, no, there's still a class if there's still an enforced division of labor, but there's gonna be divisions of labor because we're not all good at the same things, and I'm not gonna pretend that we're gonna be at communism. Like I'm not gonna pretend that we all become, you know. In fact, pretending that we do that is granting to right-wingers a critique of Marxism that Marx actually isn't guilty of. Marx explicitly says we are not equal in the sense that we are not all the same, and thus this concept just doesn't apply to what we're talking about. We can talk about material equity, we can talk about equity of power, whatever. Now, Marx doesn't say the latter part, but what we cannot talk about is equality as an abstract principle, because when applied to things that are different, it's a category error. And
yeah, no, precisely. Plus, it's not even appropriate for everything. I mean, you know, there are certain kinds of skills, there's certain kind of forces of production, right? That we've already socialized. We're more or less socialized as best we can. So there, for example, there's no division of labor in society that that has a scribes in it anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's because society is largely literate. And I take it that there are any number of those things which we do well to socialize in precisely the same way. That means it's to the benefit of all if everyone has a general skill set that's far more expansive than the one that we've already been delivering.
Yeah, we should teach everybody basic medicine, for example. Like, I actually don't know why like health class doesn't involve like, here's how you would be a nurse.
Yep. Basic medicine, first aid medicine. Why don't we understand how to cook and clothe and feed ourselves in this way, right? I mean, like, there are certain things that do not need to be part of the division of labor anymore. But of course, certain other things will have to be decided.
Want everybody watching over nuclear waste. Like, so, like,
right.
at their and I admit it's something. This is why I'm not like a total anarchist. It's something that we do have to figure out and monitor because Yucca Mountain's not going away now that it exists. And I don't want Yucca Mountain leaking out and destroying the earth because we're all just avoiding the problem. But in a real sense, I do think a whole lot of stuff is the separation for artificial. And that includes things that ensure my job. For example, I think credentialing in a social society won't exist. I know Paul Cockshott and people disagree with me, but I'm like, no, like, yeah, you might have to take a test to teach. I think Marx even talks about it's okay for the state to regulate who teaches if they take a test to make sure they know what they're talking about. But that's it.
Sure.
That's all. That's the only function he actually, which is wild when I point out Karl Marx is kind of skeptical of public education other than it should be funded socially and free. But like he doesn't really think the state should control it, which is wild to throw at people. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, no, he doesn't. I mean, he doesn't think the state should control education. So
what else could it be but also ideological? I mean, so my dear roommate is in an American government class, and I think their first assignment is to write a short essay about what it means to them to be un-American. And he asked me just over dinner, he asked me this question, and I'm like, there's no such thing as an American. What's
it doesn't mean a goddamn thing to me. Like, actually, my personal identity is like I'm a Southerner. Fuck off.
Yeah, that's right. Leave me my properly my honestly won bigotries, would you please, rather than try to give me the artificial bigotry.
Right, exactly. Give me my organic bigotry of the region I'm from, and not the synthetic bigotry of the fucking abstract nation that I'm from. Like I'm entitled to hate Alabamians like a Georgian man. God damn it. No,
right.
And it's also where I think our nationalism should go is basically team sports under communism. Because I'm just like, we should really care about that because it doesn't matter. And we'll supplement our tribal impulse.
There's nothing better than the deep libidinal investment in the irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly.
That's something very humane, I think.
Because if we know it's irrelevant, we're not convincing ourselves we need to kill each other over real shit. So I prefer a good soccer riot. That would be what most riots would be under communism. Would be a good soccer riot.
That's right. I want to commit a crime for something that's authentically my reason,
which is no reason at all. And you know, it'll be fun to pay the social price for it. But I mean, I think this is crucial, and in a sense, to get people moving away from worker as identity, because I have been trying to get people to realize for a long time that workerism will not be and cannot lead to socialism, and I don't know what it will lead to, because so many of the collective agents that people construct for workerist identity are pulled out of their ass. They have the same problems of privileging one kind of worker over another, that, you know, like when people talk about, well, like black privileged elite speaking for all black people, well, that's going to happen with a workers' politics like this too. Like if you don't take worker as a structure and not, you know, as something that discretely exists, you end up with the same bullshit of any identity politics. And in some Marx, the answer to identity politics under social democratic conditions since Occupy has been to recapitulate an identity politics, and indeed resurrect and reinvent prior weird categories to maintain it that have been previously discarded. You know, things have gotten bad. Like,
yeah, and we'll get beyond it. I mean, hopefully we'll get beyond this. I'm the optimist. That's the real difference between you and me, is I'm the optimist. I think that we will get beyond it. I mean, you know, it took a lot to get here to a class that you can be accused of being a class first, you know, whatever it is, socialist. Good, that's progress. Progress with respect to the 1990s. Progress.
I agree. Yeah, but the class first socialism is actually like, yeah, we should want to be that. Like, it's not even that I think that I don't even subordinate all these other concerns about sexuality and gender to class, but I think the most important fucking thing that we deal with is class. Like, I actually don't know how like when I try to tell people, like, look, if I try to formulate anti-racism for a communist future under capitalist conditions, I don't know that I'm actually formulating shit that's going to actually lead to an anti-racist future under communism either, because I just don't know. Those conditions do not exist yet. I do not know what the contradictions are. Like, right. And I assume that ethnic and racial tensions will get dramatically reduced by getting rid of capitalism, but I actually don't know they're going to go away because frankly, it became immediately clear that we're going to be debating the national question after there are no longer nations on the planet. Like we're still going to be talking about the fucking national question when there aren't nation states anymore. Like,
precisely. No, I mean, you might never get around those. Their ideological commitments have this terrible way of sticking around, but you can remove them of their teeth, and their teeth comes from their being imbricated in relations of exploitation.
Exactly.
So there it is. We solved it.
Yeah. And surprisingly, like, you only said two things that I kind of adjusted to. The funny thing is, I think when I listen to the measures taken, as in when I listen to the regrettable century, my temperament is with Jason, but my argumentation tends to be with you. So it's like
we're so alike that way, man.
I actually have gotten to the point where I agree. I didn't used to agree with it, but no, I'm like, yeah, optimism right now in regards to the current situation is just frankly cowardice. Like, but I don't know that I actually take that in replying to socialism. It's like optimism about what the social democrats can do in regards to moving the Democrats to getting rid of Medicare for all, or getting rid of, which is effectively what they did do. Actually getting us to Medicare for all. I've never been optimistic about that because the conditions, like when I look at the broad array of conditions and start applying like game theory and all this other stuff, unfortunately, I've learned that I can't trust other people with game theory, because when they do game theory, they seem to come to Vivek Chibber in particular in his most recent book. I'm like, you came to the exact opposite conclusions to me with this game theoretical calculus that you're doing. But whatever.
Yeah, optimism
argues for workerism, so it's like
I find optimism subjectively easier. I also find it instinctive, and I take it that that's a feature of my personality and not a feature of my Marxism. I tend to be that kind of a guy or something,
right?
But that's as deep as I think it goes.
Yeah, I have this quote from Mike Davis that I always throw at people about like hope and optimism is irrelevant. And like the fight isn't about fighting with hope or not. When you're in Leningrad, if you're in Leningrad or Stalingrad and the Nazis are coming, hope is not a question. Like, it doesn't fucking matter if you have hope or not. It doesn't even matter if you think you can win. It helps if you think you can win, but that's not ultimately what matters. What matters is that you have an objective and you can fight. And that's where I think we need to go. And I think the big takeaway is, one, class is a structure, and two, don't try to think you can inculcate some kind of class politics in this current class state that we live in and think it's going to work out for you. Like, even the Bolsheviks thought they had to crush the fucking state. And if anything, they didn't go far enough in doing it. And
not nearly far enough.
Right. And if anything, if I have one sin I attribute to Kautsky, it's that. It is not like it is not being skeptical enough of the bourgeois state. Even as much as Lenin, and people will tell me, oh, Lenin didn't mean it when he quoted Pannekoek against Kautsky and State and Revolution. Like, it doesn't matter if he meant it or not, because he's still right. Like even if it was a cynical, even if he was right for cynical reasons, he was right. Like, the bourgeois nation state will be bourgeois. You can't make it not.
Commitment is neither optimistic nor pessimistic.
Exactly.
It's just commitment. And I take it we can make people politically committed without, or we can help people become politically committed without lending them optimism or pessimism. or class identity, or a new identity that they can take home to their, to their spouses, I mean, or take home to their private lives, where, now they can become something.
Hey, Mom,
What
did
if
you
you
know I
try-
was a productive, socially necessary worker as opposed to the unproductive, socially necessary workers are the unproductive, unsocial necessary worker?
Yeah, that's right. Mom, I'm exploited at work.
Yeah. And
Uh,
and it gets us out of debate. So we're like, there's no silver sector proletariat. Okay, what does that mean? Or we should valorize those who are productive under capital, under communism. This is a Maoist answer. It's like productivity is one of the defining categories. And I'm like, but productivity in both Das Capital and in theories of surplus value is productive to capital surplus. It's not productive to social. In fact, Marx goes through things that you need that are not productive to the social surplus that even capitalists have because they are necessary. One of which is teachers, but there's a bunch of things like nurses and doctors and a whole lot of the broadly professional world. Many of whom are wage earners, some of whom are petit bourgeois, some of whom are bourgeois, but you need them. You do need them. Like, I don't want a world without fucking doctors. Like,
the division of labor asserts itself because we're, we exist in a world in which it just makes sense to have that kind of specialization, given the fact that we just don't have a machine that is able to, look, if there's a Star Trek like machine that's able to take a cut in my arm and you, with the wave of a wand, able to
and you just need
put it
like
back together.
one doctor to make sure it's programmed correctly. Like, yeah, that'd be great. And under socialism, it's not a threat to anybody either. It's like we now can produce other shit with our extra time that we want to, because I'm not having to learn how to stitch because the machine will do it for me. I just got to make sure the machine is guided correctly. Have a nice day. And the problem that we have is that under capitalism, that actually is reductive to profits over time. It's not the only thing that drives profit down, but it is. And people argue me that it is. And I'm like, no, but the fixed and variable capital are real. Like, they're real categories.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And they're limiting. They're deeply, deeply limiting. We live also in a less technologically advanced society because the only technologies that we've invested in are labor-saving technologies, rather than labor-augmenting technologies. And that's crazy.
True, actually. And even with communication technologies and stuff, we have, and you've seen this in the klug of the internet. I always talk about overcomplexity theory, and like, one of the things is capitalism drives idiotic overcomplexity, and look at Facebook, which worked fine in 2009 and now can't even search itself in 2020, or even take the stupid article on Jacobin about nationalizing dating apps. My God.
I didn't read that. Oh my God. I haven't read that yet.
But anyway,
history has prepared me it.
I mean, like, look, I don't have a problem with with a socialized, not nationalized, dating app, but and I'm sure under communism we find all kinds of new ways for people to hook up, pair bond, de-pair bond, etc. But I'm not worried about that right now.
No, I'm not. Yeah. Good Christ. No, I mean, we're at a crisis point. I mean, look, I take it that one of the deeply disturbing things, and this is politically relevant, although not related to classes, and this was, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a gay Marxist, and therefore it's Pride Month, and I'm in a bad mood about society. This is my one pessimistic time. It's like, goodness Christ, we've lost the sexual revolution. Boy, did we get creamed. We lost it so poorly that instead of talking about ending the family, we're talking about getting getting adoption rights. We've been driven to this, militaristic family values. It's all the right wing. So much so that the protesters, the Christian protesters that I saw just on Saturday, I felt compelled to go up to them and be like, how do you know I don't agree with you? I don't even want to be here. This is a terrible world.
It's funny because I was complaining about how, because the exploitativeness of the way sex is used in film. Now we have boring sexless films. I do not think
totally.
That we
and
would.
By the way, the sex in the films that was all advertising anyway. And the saddest part of all the sexualization, and on social media, that this is probably also a factor, is that it's just advertising dollars, which aren't going to help the profitability crisis. So it's if we have become hypersexualized due to advertising investments, it hasn't even benefited the crisis in profitability, and will ultimately not even be useful for capitalists.
No. And to be fair, it also statistically hasn't benefited anyone's sex life, because people under 35 fuck less than any generation that we know about. So like there's stat after stat. I've always had people like, well, today's mores. And I'm like, yeah, they have looser mores, they being people younger than me. I occasionally have dated as young as 30, so I suppose I know now. But I do teach high schoolers, and they actually kind of confirm what I think. They live in a largely sexless universe, partially because they are overstimulated with sexual imagery in one area of their life, but then it is codified and now cut off from every other area, because now like the only the parts of the world that are seen as sexual is like porn and Pride Month, and not really Pride Month because it's really more corporate. So
right, nightmare. Absolute nightmare. No, I mean, we can agree on this pessimism, which is that we live in an awful, terrible world on purpose for some reason.
Yeah, I don't know why they have to make everything fun not fun, but they're fucking good at it. Like I was actually thinking about this. I'm like, you ruined DIY art for me. You ruined my. I don't even like shitty movies anymore. Now all I have is good taste, because you've made shitty movies shittier.
Shitty movies are really bad. That's true. They've gotten so. We watched, for example, just the other day, we watched the movie Muscle Beach Party, which is one of the beach party movies. It has Stevie Wonder in it. It's a teeny bop 1964, I think. 1964, like literally a beach party movie with teenagers, trying to screw one another, right? But it ends with a concert with the young Stevie Wonder, and I thought, this is a trash film the way they ought to be made,
It's a fun trash film. It's not even like trash. Like now I have like 50 layers of fucking canon to understand before I can even begin to approach your trash movie with no meaning except maybe U.S. military propaganda, kind of, but you're not even good at that because you're not making the military sexier by doing this. So I don't even know what you're doing. Like, that's where I'm at. I'm like, this is like all the worst shit about the serials of the 30s with all the worst shit about the neoliberal blockbuster of the 80s. And also it's sexless and boring.
Sexless and boring. Advertisers aren't even good at advertising anymore.
Man, it's just shitty, man. And so like, I remember the promise of the 90s of a transgressive, weirdly gay, queer future, and now everyone's like, I'm hearing like, well, there aren't straight kids anymore. And I'm like, that doesn't mean they're boring. I mean, they're not boring. They're still just as square as they've ever been. They're just not straight anymore.
That's right. No, now instead they're cats or whatever they are in order to be sexual. It's terrible. This is where we go to our four boomer Marxist moment. Sorry. This is really just younger audience members. This is just us complaining about our old age.
We're just old. You guys probably have fun somehow that I don't understand, and can't find out myself. I mean, it isn't. I was actually thinking about this the other day. I was like, I thought after the AIDS scare was over and we had antiviral drugs that we'd be back to 70s levels of decadence in like a week, and that is not what happened.
So I'll tell you this, since we're on this up just briefly before I go, is I every month I get together with a bunch of friends who are like-minded in this, and one of the things we do is we discuss and then systematically study the gay culture of the 1970s, the golden era between the Stonewall and the beginning of AIDS, which is hard to pinpoint, but I'll go to 1985 when you get to this media.
1982 and 85, yeah.
Yeah, between 82 and 85, exactly. We screen a film, and then there's a whole literature associated with this. I take it this is a huge mind. I mean, even richer in a certain way than the Second International is for Marxism. But unlike the Second International is for Marxism, I don't see any part of gay culture moving toward resurrecting its golden age. So anyway, very, very sad. There's another way in which we've lost. We just feels like we lost the whole sexual revolution.
I mean, it's funny because everybody thinks we won the culture war, and I'm like, we did?
Oh, no, we lost.
Question mark? It seems like we won it, like granting the other side all of its goals. Like,
that's right. That's right. And by the way, abortion's about to be illegal everywhere. So.
Oh yeah, I think people are like, oh, it's going to be. I'm like, no, they're going to try to pass a national ban, and I'm not putting odds on that going through, even under Republican Congress, but I'm also not putting odds on it not going through. And the other things that they might do is gay marriage might be, your whole sexual counter-revolution may be undone by the counter-revolutionaries anyway. So
that's right, for their own culture politics, trying to
which ironically, I think Ron Dreyer, as the last note before I let you go, I think Ron Dreyer is actually right that this will kill the religious right will die after this, because it's going to turn too much of society against them. Ron Dreyer, actually, the religious right guy, has been talking like Adrian Vermeule and Patrick Deneen, and being like, if you try to impose this from the top by legal fiat, then what's going to happen is, as soon as some of you start dying, they're going to crush you. And unfortunately for us, it also means we're going to be tied for the Democratic Party, who can't do anything for a little while longer, probably. Which is why I said, as a side note and an asterisk, and this almost sounds conspiratorial, but why I suspect there was little incentive for them to actually do anything about this if they knew that the electoral calculus would be in their favor if the Supreme Court did what it did.
Yeah, it's another version of, you have to vote for us because they want to do something terrible.
And look, we let them.
Well, we have to let them, or else we can't say that they want to do something terrible unless they do terrible things. So it's good cop, bad cop, and we're the victim.
Yeah, it's and the people don't notice that the current state would be both the good cop and the bad cop at the moment. I actually do think people are noticing this. I've seen more for all the initial like Democrats blaming Bernie and Susan Sarandon for this, which was a huge thing the first day, and for all today, everyone's like, AOC 2024 re-legalize abortion, and I'm like, okay, how? But for all that aside, it does seem like a lot of people realize that the Democrats can't even do anything when you vote them in. And so, like, the argument of it, like, as a cynical ploy, if it's what they did for this as a cynical ploy, it backfires, and it actually makes them look completely powerless to do anything. Because they're in power and they can't stop this. So, like, and so why the fuck should we vote for them again? Because we already did. So
that's right. It is not rational to vote under those conditions. It's not a rational thing to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. We talked a lot about class politics and a little bit about our weird, not sexually liberated dystopia.
It's always a pleasure. It really is always a lot of fun.
It's fun. It's fun to come on. So yeah. So you have a book that's coming out sometime?
Yeah, I just finished a manuscript called the Materialist Conception of Music History. It's about to be fully under review by Brill. I also working on, as I said, I'm working on a book review on this new Bogdanoff book that came out. And yeah, I've got a couple things in the fire. So and of course, The Measures Taken is still working on its next episode. One of our hosts is dealing with a medical issue, and so we're postponed for a hot second, but we're going to get right back on with the next episode on the Russian Revolution, which it's going to be a blast.
Yeah, I am. You guys are basically on season 2. You've left the beginning of the Second International, and now are getting into the deadly 20s. So that'll be
fun.
Fun.
Absolutely. I've been reading all the histories of the Russian Revolution, like all one by one now, from John Reed to Rabinowitz to Leninism under Lenin. I mean, all of these histories, and it's been a blast. So maybe at some point.
Yeah, I actually love the Rabinowitz, but I often do read the Orlando Fiege as actually kind of the other side of that, and it's kind of a dialectical argument. I know Orlando Fiege's a liberal, but some of the points he actually makes about like the working class and the peasantry under the Russian Revolution are pretty valid. So I have them like in my head arguing with each other most of the time.
I'll check that out. That's good advice.
It's I like to put the different. I do this with Stalin too. Like when a lot of my theories on a lot of my discussions of Stalin, people get frustrated with because I'm pretty anti-Stalin, obviously, but although not obviously anymore, which is a weird thing. But whatever. But I have to admit there are areas in which Stalin actually argued the correct line.
Isn't that terrible?
Yeah. So it's like well. He's not always wrong. like you know, I don't think Thon was a particularly good theoretician, even though he tried to make himself one. And he was I'm reading the book on what he read, and that's been interesting. Now I want a book on that for Trotsky and Mao. Like, tell me their library and when did they read it? Like, I want to know. I want to be able to start putting something together about what their inputs were. But
that's cool.
But yeah, it's I do that with Stalin too, because there are times when I like roll my eyes at the Trotskyist conception of Stalin, where it makes it sound like it could have been another way, and I'm like, it could have been another way, but it probably would have still not worked. So like there are many ways to fail. So you know, there was only a couple of ways for the Russian Revolution to succeed, and I kind of think Lenin was right in what he said had to happen. Had it to happen initially, and it didn't. So you know, like, if you don't have a developed world socialism to hook up with, you're kind of fucked in the periphery, whatever the hell that really is.
Yeah, they actually genuinely are. It happened where it should not have happened, and it didn't need to happen. It was a historical contingency. 1,000 things could have gone wrong. Could easily been the case that the Bolsheviks did not come to power. It was given how contingent it was. It seems madness that anyone tried to reproduce its success,
particularly in a capitalist society.
In the heart of capitalism. Oh,
yeah, we're going to try to reproduce that in the one area that we are almost certain that every major important condition is different, from the structure of law to the structure of the economy to whether or not there's a peasantry, to the geopolitical elements of land that you could possibly use. Like, none of that applies to the United States. Come on. Or even to Europe now, like, if we're completely honest. Like, I have a couple of friends who I really respect, but who still think like a German revolution is necessary. And I like fall over laughing. I'm just like, do you really think we have to recapitulate what we didn't do in the early 20th century because that's the only way it can possibly work? Really? Yeah. Anyway.
Well, it's the only way it did work, except for it didn't. Yeah, no,
the only way it did work until 1992 happened.
Yeah, back to capitalism. Can't tell you that. Anyway, we'll see each other soon.
Yep, see you around, man. All right, let's end on the chill close and my face.